They say the forest holds secrets, secrets no one should ever uncover. I didn't believe it, at least, not at first. But that was before my last camping trip, before I ventured into the deep woods, miles away from any town, any other people. Out there, beneath towering trees and thick underbrush, I thought I'd find peace. Solitude, a chance to clear my mind under an open sky, far from the routines of everyday life. But I didn't realize I had wandered into a place where nature, it seemed, was hiding something from me. Before I go deeper into the story, welcome, and make sure to subscribe to the channel, Echoes of Nightmares, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on any of the future scary tales. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button too. Now back to my story. As I set up my camp, there was a feeling, an awareness I couldn't quite place. I'd been camping countless times before, so I knew how to brush off the little fears that creep up in any dark, unfamiliar place. This time though, something was different. I could feel it before I even pitched my tent. The forest had grown silent, a quiet so deep it felt almost heavy, pressing down on everything around me. The only sound that broke the stillness was the soft patter of rain that began to fall, coating the leaves with a sheen that shimmered faintly in the fading daylight. I shook it off, telling myself it was just nerves, that it was nothing but the quiet calm of the wilderness. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought lingered. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. I had settled in just as the rain picked up, and by nightfall, I was completely surrounded by the sound of water tapping against the fabric of my tent. It should have been relaxing, even soothing, but somehow it only amplified the strange sense of unease. Every drop seemed louder than it should have been, echoing through the darkness, blending with distant sounds that didn't quite belong, rustling that seemed too deliberate, whispers that seemed to shift with the wind. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I'd spent too much time listening to ghost stories, that this was just the usual discomfort of a night in the wild. But as the hours wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just beyond the reach of my campfire's glow. It felt like I was being watched, tracked by something hidden in the shadows. I tried to brush it off, but each time I closed my eyes, I felt it even more intensely. The kind of awareness that prickles at the edge of your senses, that makes you question if there's really anything there, or if it's just your imagination working overtime. The rain fell harder, and with it came a new sound, faint but undeniable. It started out as a low murmur, something almost human, like distant voices whispering just out of reach. I listened, trying to convince myself it was just the sound of the wind pushing through the trees, twisting in strange ways as it moved. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. It was no trick of the wind. I was sure of it. As I strained to hear, a flash of lightning lit up the forest for just a brief second, and in that instant, I thought I saw something, just at the edge of my sight, a shape moving in the rain, too far to make out clearly, but close enough to unsettle me. Then, it was gone, leaving only the fading echo of that strange whispering, mingling with the steady drum of rain. I stayed awake, listening, staring out into the darkness, wondering if I had really seen something, or if my mind was simply playing tricks on me. But as the hours stretched on, the forest around me grew darker, colder, and that strange presence felt closer, surrounding me in ways I couldn't explain. And all I could do was sit there, trapped in the darkness, waiting for the dawn. I wasn't alone on this trip. I had 3 friends with me, Alex, Jess, and Eric. We've been planning this camping adventure for weeks, eager to leave behind the noise and distractions of the city and lose ourselves in a place untouched, somewhere the world still felt raw. We'd heard about a forest deep in the backcountry, miles from any nearby town. Few people ventured there, and those who did spoke of it like a secret, describing it as beautiful but strange. Perfect for a weekend escape, or so we thought. We set out early that morning, the air still thick with fog, winding through narrow, rough roads that grew narrower and rougher as we pushed deeper into the wilderness. After hours of driving, the trees closed in, their branches reaching across the road like long fingers, as if to keep us out. But we pressed on, our excitement rising with each mile. By midday, we arrived at a small clearing, a spot just wide enough to set up our tents. The place felt vast, open, yet somehow cloaked, concealed by the dense forest that surrounded us. We couldn't see or hear another soul for miles, just the gentle rustling of leaves and the faint trickle of a nearby stream. At first, it felt like paradise. The air was crisp, cool, and every breath filled us with a sense of freedom. But as we settled in, an odd sensation settled in too. It was subtle, an undercurrent I couldn't quite shake, like a nagging thought I couldn't put my finger on. I caught Alex glancing around a few times, too, his face tense as if he'd noticed something off. Jess tried to laugh it off, saying the silence just felt different here. She joked that we were probably just spooking ourselves after being cooped up in the city for so long. Eric agreed, calling it nature's white noise, but he kept glancing over his shoulder, his smile just a little too forced. As the day wore on, the air grew colder, thicker, as if something was creeping closer. Even the trees seemed to shift, their branches twisting in ways that felt unnatural, casting long shadows that stretched across our camp. We should have been comfortable, settled, but instead, the forest felt aware of us like it was watching. Each of us felt it, though no one wanted to admit it. It was a strange, almost animal feeling, an instinct urging us to stay alert. By the time we finished setting up, the sun was dipping low, casting deep shadows across the clearing. The light drizzle we'd ignored earlier in the day began to fall harder, echoing against our tents, blending with the distant murmur of the forest. The silence was heavy now, thick enough to feel, and it seemed to press down on us, quieting even our voices. No one said it out loud, but I think we all sensed it. The forest had grown darker, and with each passing minute, it felt as if something was drawing closer, something just beyond our sight. Then, just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the first sound broke the silence. It was faint, almost like a cry, echoing through the trees. At first, we thought it was an animal, maybe a distant call carried on the wind. But as we listened, the sound grew sharper, more defined, and it wasn't long before we realized it didn't quite sound like an animal at all. There was something disturbingly human about it, like a voice straining just beyond our hearing. Jess was the first to laugh it off, insisting it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks. But I could see it in her eyes, and all their eyes. None of us truly believed that. It was a moment that hung between us, heavy, uncomfortable, a reminder that we were intruders here, in a place that was ancient, untamed, and indifferent to our presence. As night fell, the forest seemed to come alive in ways we hadn't expected. The rain picked up, drumming against the tents, the sound filling every inch of the clearing. The night was pitch black, save for the faint glow of our campfire, and even that seemed to be swallowed by the darkness pressing in from all sides. The forest around us was alive with the kind of silence that isn't really silent at all, a quiet so thick you could feel it. And then, beneath the steady patter of rain, I heard it, a faint whisper, just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, I thought it was the rain or the wind moving through the trees. But as I listened, the whispers grew clearer, distinct, as if someone was standing just beyond the edge of our camp, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. I turned to Alex, about to ask if he heard it too, but the look on his face told me everything. He'd heard it. We all had. The whispers came and went, barely audible, but unmistakably there, weaving through the rain like a thread unraveling in the darkness. Eric, trying to keep things light, laughed it off, saying it was just our minds playing tricks. But even he couldn't hide the nervous glance he kept casting over his shoulder, his eyes searching the shadows just outside the light. We told ourselves it was nothing. We'd heard stories about the way the mind can conjure up sounds in the silence, especially in a place as isolated as this. Then came the footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, crunching the fallen leaves and twigs scattered across the forest floor. It started slow, like something circling our camp, taking its time, each step deliberate and measured. I strained my eyes, searching the shadows, but I couldn't see anything. Just darkness, the trees looming over us, and the faint suggestion of movement. A shadow here, a flicker there. My skin prickled, and a cold sweat broke over me. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that we were all just spooking ourselves. But deep down, I knew there was something out there, something watching us. Jess huddled closer to the fire, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. She whispered that she felt eyes on her, that the forest felt aware. We laughed, nervously, trying to shake off the fear gnawing at the edges of our thoughts. But as the night wore on, the feeling only grew stronger. Every rustle, every whisper seemed directed at us, a presence lurking just out of sight, watching from the darkness. Alex, the most skeptical among us, finally admitted he felt it too. And that's when I knew we were in trouble. It was Eric who noticed the carvings. He wandered just a few steps into the trees, trying to get a better look at whatever might be out there. When he returned, he had a strange look on his face, his eyes wide, his voice low and tense as he told us to come see. We followed him, hesitantly, until we saw it. There, on the rough bark of the trees surrounding our camp, were strange symbols, crude and twisted, carved deep into the wood. They were like nothing I'd ever seen, shapes that seemed to twist in on themselves, unsettling in their simplicity. There was something about them that felt wrong, as though they weren't meant to be seen. Jess reached out to touch one, her fingers brushing the rough surface, but she quickly drew her hand back as though burned. She said it felt cold, unnaturally so, despite the warmth of the fire just a few feet away. None of us could explain the symbols, and no one wanted to stay close to them. They seemed to radiate a silent warning, a message we couldn't understand but instinctively knew to avoid. We returned to our campfire, each of us shaken in our own way, trying to brush off the unease. The rain continued to fall, steady, relentless, filling the silence we didn't dare break. We sat there, each of us lost in our thoughts, the shadows pressing in closer, darker, as if the forest itself were closing around us. And then, just as we were beginning to settle, the scream tore through the night. It was loud, piercing, cutting through the rain and echoing through the trees with a raw, animal intensity. My blood ran cold, and every hair on my body stood on end. It was a sound I'll never forget, a scream so filled with terror and pain that it seemed almost inhuman. We looked at each other, frozen, no one daring to speak, to move. Jess clutched my arm, her grip tight, her eyes wide with fear. And in that moment, I knew we weren't alone. Whatever was out there, it was watching us, waiting, and it was far closer than we had ever imagined. The scream left us shaken, each of us frozen in place, too afraid to move, to even breathe. For a moment, there was only the sound of rain falling around us, but now it seemed louder, pounding against the earth like the heartbeat of something lurking nearby. None of us wanted to speak. We sat there, staring at the darkness, each one hoping someone else would break the silence. Finally, Eric stood up, his face pale but determined. He muttered something about needing to check it out, about not being able to ignore it. We tried to stop him, to tell him it was too dangerous, but he wouldn't listen. And so, reluctantly, we followed, the four of us stepping carefully into the forest, our flashlights casting narrow beams of light that barely seemed to cut through the shadows. We didn't have to go far before we saw it. A figure, tall and dark, standing motionless among the trees, just at the edge of our sight. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but it was unmistakable, a silhouette against the faint light breaking through the leaves. It was impossible to tell if it was human, animal, or something else entirely. And as we watched, it seemed to shift, the shape subtly twisting, bending, in ways that defied logic. Jess whispered for us to go back, her voice barely audible, but I couldn't look away. My pulse was racing, my throat dry, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness, leaving nothing but silence in its place. We stumbled back to the campsite, each of us shaken, glancing over our shoulders, feeling as though we were being watched with every step. Back at camp, things only grew stranger. I noticed my flashlight had been moved, placed neatly by the fire, even though I could have sworn I'd left it in the tent. Alex's backpack was unzipped, its contents spilled out as if someone, or something, had gone through it. The faint smell of rot hung in the air, sickly sweet and pungent, seeming to seep into our clothes, our skin, until it felt like the very air we breathed was tainted. Then came the cold. It wasn't just the chill of the rain or the night air. It was a bone-deep, unnatural cold, as if the warmth had been drained from the world. We huddled around the fire, shivering, but the flames barely seemed to make a difference. I could feel the cold wrapping around us, pressing in closer, suffocating, and for the first time, I truly felt like we weren't alone. Something was with us, lingering just out of sight, and it wanted us to know it was there. Eric tried to call for help, pulling out his phone, but there was no signal. Nothing but static, a faint, distorted crackle that seemed to grow louder the longer he held it to his ear. He cursed, throwing the phone down in frustration, and we all realized at once just how alone we truly were. The forest stretched on for miles in every direction, a wall of black trees and endless rain, and there was no way out, no one coming to help us. We decided to stay awake, to keep watch in shifts, each of us taking turns to sit by the fire, to guard against whatever might be lurking in the darkness. I took the first shift, wrapping myself in my jacket, staring into the rain, my eyes scanning the shadows for any hint of movement. Every sound seemed amplified, each raindrop like a footstep, each rustle like a whisper, until I couldn't tell what was real and what was my mind playing tricks. When my shift ended, I woke Jess, her face pale, her eyes wide as she took my place by the fire. I lay down, trying to ignore the gnawing fear in my stomach, telling myself it was nothing, that everything would be fine by morning. But even in my tent, I couldn't escape the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing there, unmoving, waiting, watching. During Jess's shift, I heard her muttering under her breath, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought she was talking to herself, trying to keep herself calm, but as I listened, I realized she was responding to something just outside the tent. She kept asking, "Who's there?" Her voice tense, afraid. But there was no answer, only the soft hum of rain and an occasional, faint reply that sounded like her own voice echoing back, distorted, twisted, as if mocking her. Each shift grew worse, the rain seeming to grow louder, each shadow in the forest taking on a more sinister shape. Alex swore he saw faces in the trees, twisted, ghostly, watching him with hollow eyes. He sat by the fire, clutching his flashlight, his knuckles white as he scanned the darkness, barely blinking, as though afraid to look away. And then, during the final shift, it was my turn again. I sat there, alone in the dark, my heart pounding, every nerve on edge. The rain had slowed to a faint drizzle, the silence stretching out, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves. And that's when I heard it, a voice, soft, almost familiar, calling my name from the edge of the clearing. It was calm, gentle, laced with a warmth that didn't belong in that cold, dark place. I froze, my mind racing, every instinct telling me to ignore it, to stay by the fire. But the voice came again, closer this time, clearer, so familiar it sent a chill down my spine. It was my own voice, calling to me from somewhere in the darkness. Unable to resist, I stood, stepping away from the fire, moving toward the sound. The rain seemed to grow louder, drowning out my thoughts, pulling me closer and closer, until the camp faded behind me. And then, just as I reached the edge of the clearing, the voice stopped, leaving me alone in the silence. I glanced back and saw the fire flickering in the distance, my friends asleep, unaware that I had left. And that's when I felt it, a presence standing right behind me, so close I could feel its breath on my neck. I turned, slowly, my heart pounding, and there, just inches away, was a figure, tall and dark, its face hidden in shadow, its eyes fixed on me with an intensity that froze me in place. It leaned closer, its voice a low whisper, saying my name in that same, twisted version of my own voice. I staggered back, tripping over a root, scrambling to my feet as I ran back to camp, not daring to look back. As I reached the fire, I could still hear it, my own voice calling out from the darkness, fading into the rain as the figure watched, motionless, as I fled. Back at camp, I collapsed by the fire, gasping, my hands shaking. No one else had woken up. None of them had seen or heard what I had. I tried to explain, to tell them about the figure, the voice, but the words caught in my throat, sounding absurd, unreal. They looked at me with a mixture of confusion and fear, but I could see it in their eyes. They believed me, even if they didn't want to. Standing there in the dark, I could hardly believe what I was seeing. Just beyond the firelight, half hidden by the shadows, was Eric, or at least, it looked like Eric. He was drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes staring wide and unblinking, hollow, as though there was nothing left behind them. And that smile, that silent, twisted grin, sent a cold chill down my spine. It was all wrong. Everything about it was wrong. I whispered his name, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, his expression frozen, his gaze fixed on me. Every instinct told me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy, rooted to the ground as I watched, half hoping he would just disappear. But then, he took a step closer, his head tilting slightly, almost curiously, as if he were studying me. And that's when I noticed the symbols, those strange, twisted carvings, scratched into the trees around us. I hadn't seen them before, but now they seemed to surround me, forming a circle that stretched deep into the forest. Every tree bore the same mark, the same warped symbols etched into the bark, winding like an eerie, silent language. Panicked, I stumbled back, disoriented, my head spinning. The forest around me felt foreign, unrecognizable, every tree a twisted duplicate of the last. I turned to go back to camp, but the path seemed to vanish, swallowed by the darkness. No matter which direction I looked, all I could see were those symbols, watching me, as though they were guiding me deeper into the forest rather than out of it. Meanwhile, back at camp, the others were growing restless. They exchanged worried glances, the silence hanging heavy between them. Jess checked her watch, muttering that I'd been gone for far too long, and the unease in her voice was enough to spur them into action. They gathered their flashlights, huddling close, venturing out into the forest to look for me, each step taken with a sense of growing dread. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle or faint whisper. But the forest seemed darker, more foreboding. As they moved through the trees, they noticed the symbols, etched into the trunks, twisting and coiling, as if alive. With every step, they felt the forest closing in around them, every shadow seeming to stretch, to loom closer. And then the whispers began, soft at first, almost imperceptible beneath the rain, but growing louder, circling them, until it felt as though the very air was alive with voices. The words were indistinct, a low murmur that came from every direction, echoing off the trees, impossible to locate. They called out, hoping I would respond, but the only answer was the faint, mocking repetition of their own voices, distorted, warped, as if the forest itself was speaking back. After what felt like hours, Jess's flashlight fell upon something in the undergrowth. A piece of clothing, drenched and crumpled, caught on a low-hanging branch. My jacket. She reached out to grab it, pulling it free, only to find that it lay within a circle of symbols, each one carved deeper, more precise, almost fresh, as though someone had just finished inscribing them. They looked around, their breaths catching in their throats, realizing that the symbols were everywhere now, surrounding them, forming a sort of map, a pattern that seemed to twist and spiral, leading in one direction, deeper, to the heart of the forest. They exchanged a glance, a silent question hanging between them, fear etched across their faces. But they knew they couldn't turn back, not now, not when they were so close. With one final, reluctant look behind them, they stepped into the darkness, following the path marked by those cursed symbols. With mounting dread, we gathered what little gear we had left, deciding there was no choice but to abandon the camp. Every instinct told us to run, to put as much distance as we could between ourselves and this cursed place. The rain had turned relentless, drenching us as we stumbled through the darkness, our flashlights barely cutting through the dense trees. We ran blindly, each step squelching in the mud, every breath coming in ragged gasps. But with every turn, every path we tried, the same symbols appeared, etched into the bark, guiding us in circles, back to where we started. The whispers grew louder, more mocking, weaving through the trees, a haunting melody that seemed to taunt us. Then, one of us, Jess, stopped, her face set with grim determination. "We're not getting out of here unless we break whatever spell this is," she muttered, gripping her flashlight tighter. Without waiting, she lunged toward a tree, furiously scraping at the symbols with a jagged rock. But the forest pushed back. As her hand scratched away at the marks, a low creak sounded, the kind that only massive trees make, echoing all around us. It was as though the forest itself was resisting, an ancient force waking from a long slumber, guarding its secrets. The shadows around us seemed to tighten, drawing closer, twisting into shapes that stared back with hollow, empty eyes. I stumbled back, feeling an unnatural chill snake through the air, colder than anything rain could explain. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the forest in stark, ghostly brightness. For a brief moment, I saw them, figures half glimpsed between the trees, standing impossibly still, eyes reflecting the light, like animals watching in silence. And then, just as quickly, darkness swallowed them once more. The wind whipped through the branches, the sound rising to a howl, carrying with it that same, chilling scream from earlier. But now it was close, too close. It was the kind of scream that roots itself in your bones, a sound so raw, so full of despair, it makes you want to cover your ears and run. We froze, terror coursing through us, as the figure from the shadows stepped forward, blocking our path. At first, it looked almost human, but there was something off, its movements, the unnatural bend of its limbs, the hollow pits where eyes should have been. As it approached, we could see it was draped in the soaked, tattered remains of clothes that looked eerily familiar. My stomach dropped. Those clothes, they looked like mine. We thought we were free. After what felt like hours, maybe more, we finally found a way out of the forest. Our feet were sore, our clothes soaked through, and our minds barely clinging to sanity. But no matter how fast we ran, no matter how hard we pushed ourselves, one thing remained. We never found Eric. Not a trace, not a sound. We stumbled out of the woods, broken, terrified, and desperate for the safety of the outside world. The moment we hit the clearing, we collapsed, gasping for air, not daring to look back. We should have been relieved to be away from the nightmare we'd lived through, but that wasn't how it felt. Instead, all we could do was search the empty forest line for a sign, anything that could explain what had happened. We waited, hoping against hope that Eric would emerge from the shadows, that he had somehow managed to find his own way out. But he never came. We made our way to the nearest town, shaking, barely able to speak, let alone explain the horrors we had witnessed. I can't even tell you what we told the authorities, what I told them, but when they arrived, there was nothing. No camp, no symbols carved into the trees, no sign of our missing friend. It was as if the forest had swallowed everything whole, leaving no trace behind. The police scoured the area, but it was like the forest had erased us from its memory. There were no markings on the trees, no remnants of the campsite, nothing to suggest that any of it had even existed. And when we tried to describe what we had seen, the searchers only looked at us with blank expressions, as if we had somehow imagined the entire thing, as if the forest was playing some twisted trick on us. In the weeks that followed, rumors began to circulate. Word got out about our experience, and people started talking. There were whispers of strange occurrences in those woods, of campers who had gone missing, of others who had heard the same eerie screams on rainy nights. It wasn't just our group. Others had experienced the same unsettling phenomenon, the same symbols, the same voices, the same figures in the shadows. And yet, the forest remained silent, holding its secrets close, as if daring anyone to uncover them. Some people say it's haunted, cursed by something that's been there far longer than anyone can remember. And to this day, there are those who claim to hear the screams on rainy nights, echoing through the trees, as though the forest itself is calling out to anyone who dares to enter. They say that once you enter, it's too late to leave. And maybe they're right. Perhaps some mysteries are better left unsolved. Have you ever experienced something you can't explain? Something that made you question reality? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more stories that will keep you up at night.